Welcome back to Monday Mod Tips. Today we're going to be doing a disassembly and reassembly of the Nerf Vortex FuseFire. FuseFire is a fairly interesting and somewhat unique blaster. It does have a number of controls, so we'll take a look at those first so we can make sure that everything works when it's all said and done. It is rear prime, and like any Vortex blaster, you can prime it even though it's previously primed, but you cannot pull the trigger if it's not loaded. It will not let you dry fire. There are a lot of locks in there to prevent you from doing that. It has an inline clip. You can simply load discs into the loading port right here. I think it holds 4 or 5. I think it's 4 and 1 in the chamber. I could be wrong about that. And then when you prime it, it will load and pull the trigger and it will fire. Prime it, and then just like any of the Vortex blasters, there is a disc dejamming or ejection button right here. We will want to deprime it because we don't want it primed when you go to disassemble. There is then also an on-off switch which turns on some LEDs. And the ones up here appear to be purely cosmetic, but there is also one down in the inside that appears to be a UV LED for lighting up glow-in-the-dark rounds. So that is a pretty nifty feature. There is also dart storage up there, but that's not really a control. There are no other locks or external switches or safeties or anything like that. So let's get this thing open and see how it works. There are a couple of screws up here in the front. We'll start with them. They are fairly short, and they appear to be the same length as each other. That'll then come off. There's some exposed wire there we will want to be careful with. The screws in the rail. Oh, interesting. One of those front screws was a little shorter. Now, I have no guarantee that I am the first person to open this blaster. And given the state of some of the wiring, I kind of suspect I'm not. That seems a little exposed. So it is possible that somebody else has opened this before me. Luckily, it does seem to work. And now we're getting to some longer screws. The one right here was longer. I'm definitely not the first person to open this, because somebody has done a real number stripping out or leaving unscrewed some bits. Oh goody. Yep, there are screws missing. Screws not screwed in. So I'm unfortunately not going to be able to guarantee that I am putting the screws back in the right spots for you. I apologize for that, but I don't have... Oh, there's our battery cover, and we'll take the batteries out. Some really short screws here in the handle. Oh, and this one they put the wrong screw in, and you can see what happens if you put a screw into a spot it doesn't belong. You'll end up creating a white dot on the far side where it pushes through. You can kind of flatten them back out, but the discoloration will never fully go away, but you can make it a little bit lighter. Got short screws again. And long. So it looks like the ones on the main body are longer, and then there's smaller ones along the edge. Okay, let's see if that's all of them. There we go. Alright. We are going to have some difficulty because the blaster does have wiring that is going to make it slightly more cumbersome. We're going to see just how far apart we can take this. Looks like that comes off nicely enough. Screw, okay. Can we get the electronics off this side? There are some screws. Some shorter ones. Okay, that's the switch. And the switch plate button thing. Okay. Looks like the battery housing might actually come out as well. That would be nice. Okay, so there's a section of the battery housing that comes out, but not the whole thing. So we are still, the two halves are stuck together. An awful lot of this shell, it looks like it's melted on in a couple of spots or solvent welded. So the plate could probably be popped off if you really wanted to try. If you wanted to get the plating off, it looks like it would come off fairly easily, but not necessary. So let's take a look at the business side of things. So here is our little nut for the battery housing door. It goes down in that little hole. We'll get to that later. Okay. What do we got on this side? Well, we've got our trigger. Remove. That's the mounting for our front section. And one washer-headed screw right there. Okay, I think we should... Oh, not quite. Another washer-headed screw on the trigger link, and there we go. Okay. Interesting. There's a little plate back here that tells you how many rounds it can hold, not to put rounds in upside down. That's kind of neat. Okay, same deal here. All of the plate. There's a couple of points where the shell appears to be solvent welded or melted into place. But other than that, it shouldn't be too hard to pop them loose if you wanted to paint it or whatnot. But we've got everything off of that side. And that leaves us with the complicated bit. Well, let's take out some screws and see if I regret it. Slightly longer interior screws. A shame they didn't use... Oh, okay. We got a little plate coming off of there. This is our primary firing catapult. As with many rival or vortex blasters, it uses a flinging arm that hooks under the disc, and that's why you don't want to load them upside down. It needs to be able to hook in there, and it flings them forward, and then they hit a tab on the way out, which imparts spin, and that's how they stay in the air so long. Okay, so that comes off. And then this is all pinned together, and I'm going to leave it pinned together. The only thing in there is, of course, our main spring, our flinging arm, and the rubber bumper and its spring. There is then one screw. If you were an adventurous person and wanted to hammer those pins out, which would unfortunately very much risk breaking the structure. And I'm hoping I can show it on camera. There is a washer-headed screw in there, and there are, we can kind of see from the back side, 3 screw holes, and mine is in the middle. And if you wanted to increase or decrease the power, that screw is holding one side of the main spring in place. I can see it there. It's holding the bottom half of the main spring, and if it's screwed into the center hole. If you moved it to the forward hole, it would reduce the power, and if you moved it back to the furthest back hole, it would in fact increase the power. But you would have to take this whole assembly apart, and that would be dubious because these are pinned in, not screwed in, and yeah, it's gonna sproing when you take it apart. It's gonna be unpleasant. I don't recommend it, but if you wanted to, that is how you would. This housing appears to all just be clipped or pinned. There's no screws in it. Can we? We can, okay. And we can get it apart, yep. We got one plate there, and then we have our catch, which is spring-loaded, non-captive spring, so be careful about that. And then there's that whole plate. And that's going to be wacky to get back together. Now, hanging off the bottom here, we have 2 locks, and of course they're different. But these spring-loaded bits here are the locks that prevent you from pulling the trigger if the blaster is not loaded. And then we have one more little lock right there. And probably another kind of lock. Again, non-captive springs on all of this. That's just unnecessary. Okay. That leaves us with our magazine and loading mech. Isn't that fun? Okay, yeah, we've got a slide lock that keeps it from... Make sure you only ever load one round at a time, though I appear to have... There we go. Okay. Let's take some more parts out. We are getting so into the reeds here. Okay, some sort of a... Oh, okay, this is the... I guess you would say the magazine follower? For lack of a better term? Oh, no, that's the loading gate. Okay. Whatever that is, it is pinned in place. Okay, we'll get to that in a second. Okay, there's the wheel that imparts the spin on the disc. Can we get this lid off? Okay. And then here we have a couple of moving parts. That one's pinned in place and sprung. That one... Oh, weird. There is the top... or the bottom of the magazine housing, I think, is basically... yeah, okay, so this is the top of the actual chamber, and that's where the UV LED is sitting, so it charges the round that's in the chamber. Here we then have the priming handle and the chamber. What actually holds that in place? Looks like more screws. Okay, we have our priming return spring right there. We have our slide lock right there. That's all of that. Not entirely sure what this lock locks. We got another small screw though. Again, non-captive springs. You'll be noticing there's a lot of small fiddly bits in this one. That has a tiny torsion spring in it that I don't think is going to be fun to get back in. I'm going to regret that. It had a small washer-headed screw. Okay, there's a plate that's just clipped in. And then, Lord, we got more moving parts. Another washer-headed screw, but it seems to be a different... Nope, it's the same. Okay. There's all the parts for our magazine, or our jam release, I guess you would say. That's been fully stripped down. That's our priming loading mechanism. And finally, we have our magazine. Oh, that's what that is. That's the follower spring. It uses a coil spring, a leaf spring, or a coiled spring like a drum magazine does. That is all clipped together. And I'm going to leave it because I don't want to mess with it any further. So, this is our magazine. It just has a follower. It's two pieces sandwiched together around a follower and the spring. And the follower slides back. Looks like it will hold, like I said. 1, 2, 3, probably, yeah, maybe 4 in the magazine and then 1 in the chamber, so 5 altogether. Pretty neat. Okay, that's a lot of small fiddly parts. This is going to be fun. Right, we can now start reassembly, and I'm not going to lie, I'm kind of concerned about this one. This one has a lot of little parts, and I'm hoping I can figure out where they all went. So we're just gonna pick a spot and reassemble it, and hopefully we can figure it out. So I'm going to start with this part, which is the mounting for our firing mechanism, this part. And this is going to get mounted right here, but there are some bits we need to add in first. The catch and its corresponding spring. If I can figure out how to get it in there. Now, what's the part that releases it? Okay. I believe it is this part, which simply clipped in. There we go. There we go. So that plate clips on top, and there's a knob on the top of the catch. It should be to the front, so that when you push on the plate, it releases the catch, like that. Then our actual catapult mechanism goes up in here, and so you're going to pull it forward so that you can get the first tab in, and then it will slide in like so. Next, we're going to tackle the priming mechanism, this part. And the first parts that we're going to actually be putting in are all part of the dart release mechanism, or the disc release, the part that pushes a disc out when you push that little button in the back. So we're going to go deep inside here. We're going to start with this part and its accompanying extension spring, and they're all going to be down in here. The extension spring is going to hook on this back part, and then this is going to hook on that front one, like so. And then there is a screw, probably, I'm hoping it's one of these washer-headed screws, the big ones. Lovely. So that goes right there. Now coming in from the other side, we're going to put in this piece, which is an arm that connects to that. And it's going to come in from the top side here. We've got this knob here is going to go in and then rotate down, and we'll come into the underside, and it's going to pop onto those two holes, those two little knobs that are sticking up, and then into this, so that pushing this pulls that back, as you can see there, and it's all spring-loaded. Very nice. Now, to keep it in place, we're going to use this piece, which simply clips in on top of it here. And careful not to break off the little tab, because that would not be good. Lovely. Okay. Now, onto that screw post, we are going to install this part. This is the little arm that actually pushes the disc out, and it should have a torsion spring on it, and the free part of the torsion spring is going to rest up against the inside here. So push it down. I don't know how well that's going to focus, but the spring should be resting on the inside there. And keep your finger on it, and we're going to use our one small washer-headed screw to screw that down. And now, when we push back on this, that part goes forward, and that will push the disc out of the chamber. So, next, we have yet another lock. We have this part, and its accompanying little spring. And it's going to go into this little trough here. There's an angled surface that should be pointing that way through the hole. So it'll rest in there right like that and should be sticking out right there. And that is the lock that, well, we'll see what it does here in a minute. All right, next we're going to put in this part. The button that actually activates it all. It's going to go on the outside, on that side right there. And you're going to need to hold it in place as you screw in this plate on top of it. Just a standard pair of our internal screws, the shorter, not the shortest, but the ones we have the most of. Now, when this little tab here that we put in, that's kind of a lock, if you push that in, you can then push on the lever and it will eject the round, or inject the disc, as you can see there. Very complicated for something that you could have just had, you know, a button that just a direct push. I don't know why they decided to do it this way. It must have seemed like a good idea at the time. Okay, next we have this plate, which again, it just clips in. And I hate it, but apparently they felt that was the easiest way to do it. All right, the final part that goes onto this goes on up here, and it is, of course, yet another lock. And it's actually a pair of parts. This part and this part. This is, of course, the cover plate. This is the little lock. Again, it will only fit in there the one way, and you kind of got to put them together. Careful with the spring. There is then a tab here that's going to hook under here and hold that part down once you can get it aligned. There we go. And then it's going to pop down onto a screw post. And then we are, once you have it clipped down into place, we're going to use one of our really short screws. There was a short, fine threaded screw, and it's the one that goes in here. Otherwise, we'd probably end up busting a hole through the bottom, and we wouldn't want that. So now that is free to move up and down. This one's free to move in and out. When you have this pushed in, that works. That is all of the moving parts on here. And finally, for this portion, we are going to put in our slide return spring. There is a hook right here that it goes on. And it's very important that you do that before you put everything else on. Otherwise, you're going to have to undo everything we're about to do. I certainly wouldn't know anything about that. Pay no attention to the fact that this spring is not there in the later parts. Next, we're going to deal with this part. It's a plate that connects our priming rod to our firing catapult, and there are a couple of moving parts that need to get added to it, starting with this, which is really a couple of parts, but it is once again kind of a lock. And it is going to go, the little spring-loaded nub, which thankfully is a fairly captive spring, is going to go in the hole between the two screw posts. Then put our spring on, and then the plate, again, will only fit on one way. The notch lines up with the screw post there. Couple of standard internal screws. Next, we're going to install the slide lock ratcheting part, this part here. It has an angled surface. It should go on that way. The notch should be towards the right. There is a hook here for the extension spring to hook on, and then it comes forward and hooks onto that screw post. Gets screwed on with one of our large washer-headed screws. All right, like that. Now we are going to add it to our priming mechanism. And the way that works is we have our priming mechanism upside down. And then we're going to hold this so that all of those screw bits and internal bits are facing up. And we're going to rotate it. and come under here and then rotate into position. So these two screw ports should be in front and it should fit in right like that. We're then going to take this part. We'll need to rotate our ratchet out of the way, and then this is going to go on. Again, there's only one way it can go. There's a narrower section and a wider section. The wider section goes towards the back, and it's going to go in right onto those two screw ports, which will then, our ratchet can then pop into place. And we are going to use, again, standard shell screws to screw those down. The internal ones, the smaller ones, not the smallest. Okay, now this should ratchet appropriately. So once it starts going forward, the ratchet engages and prevents you from going forward until you've gone all the way forward. And then once you have, it prevents you from going back the other way. Lovely. Next, we're going to install a bunch of locks, and unfortunately there's really nothing holding them in place except gravity until you put the actual catapult part in place. But we're going to start with this one. And it's going to go into this slot here in the middle. I recommend putting its spring in first. It goes underneath this tab right there, and then you can slide this in and it will rest right there, so the point is towards you. Next, we're going to install this piece, which has this small peg, and that's going to go into this small hole right here, and will be resting on top of this piece. We then have this part, which again has a larger peg. There is then one, the other side has the cutout, and that's the one that you want up. So the large peg goes that way. And then finally we have this piece. And again, there's only one way that it can go in. It's going to go into the hole right there. Once all of those are nicely resting in place, we're going to install this, our catapult mechanism. And there are 4 screw ports that it needs to line up with, and then all of those pegs need to fit through. And you might have to force it just a little bit to get it to all line up, but it should go smoothly. We're then going to use our medium range screws. There were 4 of them on the inside, and I had one that was out in the shell, and I don't know if it was supposed to be or not. But we're going to start with the 2 screws here in the back. They simply screw in. Train! And then in the front, on the top of these 2 screw posts, we have this part, which simply sits right on top of it, and it locks the catapult in place. I remember we slid the catapult forward and up to get it out. This prevents it from being able to do that. That plate then locks it in place. And then we put 2 more screws in that longer, slightly longer size. All right, that is all of our priming and main firing mechanism. The loading we haven't gotten to yet, but we can kind of test and see how everything will work. This plate is our trigger plate. When you pull the trigger, this gets pushed forward, but it can't move right now because it is locked by those 2 pegs that we put in. They are released, those locks are released on the far side. One is here in the chamber, and it is pushed down by the disc. So that is why you can't fire it if you don't have the blaster loaded. The other one is pushed down by that mechanism that we put here on the top. And that is to ensure that you can't pull the trigger if the priming mechanism is back. So the breech has to be closed for you to be able to pull the trigger. So when you have both of those pressed, that one, you can see it moving. That is the ammo detection, and that is the breech. So once both of those are pressed, now we should be able to push our trigger plate and release our catch. And sure enough, we can. So that's how all of those locks work. And that's most of the locks, I believe. So let's move on. Next we have the top of the chamber, this part. Now this is where the UV LED is mounted to light up the glow-in-the-dark rounds, and there are a couple of additional parts that sit on there. We have this part, which is simply going to click in right there. It just clips in. And then we have this part, which I believe comes in on top of it, hooks in under there, and then just clips down, just to hold that in place. We then have this part, a little roller wheel that goes on there and then needs to get pushed into place. And then finally, this simply gets clipped to the top of our priming mechanism. There we go. That is held in place unless the disc release. When the disc release is pressed, this is able to slide out, and that's what allows you to drop a disc. Otherwise, that is in fact what creates the spin. As the disc goes past it, there's only that wheel on the one side, and it causes the disc to spin in the one direction. Next, we have the magazine, this part, and we're going to be reattaching the loading gate, which is this part. And it simply goes in here. Again, only one way that it will fit. And then we have a plate that sits down on top of it. The ring there should be centered on the spring, and so that will simply go down on there. Couple, again, of our standard interior screws to hold it down. All right, we're now going to attach this to the rest of the mechanism. The first thing that we need to do is position that UV LED. There is an obvious housing where it is supposed to rest. Right there. And it kind of clips down into. Again, there's nothing that actually holds it in place. And then it's just a matter of cable management, which is the tricky part. And I'm not actually sure where the cables are supposed to run. There's an obvious part for some of them. Okay. So the front one is obviously going to run. There are a couple of pegs for it to obviously run to, and then this one looks to go through there. Our wires are coming out the side here and here, traveling up that side. We'll be able to see how all that really works once we start putting the shell together. We may reroute a few things, but there are just 4 screw holes here on the top for 4 standard screws. The last thing that gets installed to our internal assembly is this part, which is the part that forces a disc down into the chamber. It's going to sit, there's a couple of crosses right here that these are going to go into, and then these are going to go into the slots on our priming handle. So getting all that into place at the same time is a little tricky, apparently. There we go. We're not in the slot. There's one side, and there's the other side. And there we go. There are all of our internals. Now, there is absolutely no good reason to remove any of the locks from a blaster like this, because all that will allow you to do is dry fire, which will probably break it. It's not going to make it any more reliable. It's not going to prevent jams. It's just going to cause it to break. Now, if you wanted to upgrade, to improve the power by moving that spring and that screw, the only 2 screws you need to remove from this assembly to do that are these 2 right here. And I'll go ahead and demonstrate that real quick. If we take these 2 screws out, that will allow us to take off that locking plate that holds the priming mechanism in place. And now if we simply pull this forward and lift it up, we can remove the catapult, and that would allow us to then if you could find a replacement spring, go for it, but most likely you're just going to pry open those pins and move that spring. And then all you have to do to put it back in, hook the catapult in forward, pull it forward, slide it all down into place, slide it back, and put that locking plate back on, and put those 2 screws back in. All right, so that is that now fully reassembled. We're going to now reassemble the bits for the battery housing and the switch so that we have a better idea of where our wiring needs to go, which is a little bit tricky here, but we took out 2 screws on this top battery housing, which really wasn't necessary. It just, because we weren't able to take the rest of it out anyway, so standard shell screws, hold those back together. We then have our little nut. There was one little nut. It may have fallen out. Hopefully you didn't lose it, because it is what keeps the battery door in place. It goes down into this little hole. And then we have this part, which is a cover plate to hold that in place. It simply goes on top of it right there, and then, yes, that's right, yet another standard screw. And then we have our switch, which I can imagine only will fit in here one way, correct. And then we have the switch and its housing that are going to go on top. And we need to make sure that the switch is in the right position so that it will sit on there. Yep. Okay. Couple more standard internal screws. Last thing to do on this side of the shell is to put this back on, which really didn't need to come off in the first place. It simply hooks in there. All right, we are now prepared to install our entire internal assembly. We do still have this part, which is the trigger linkage, and it is going to go right here in this hole. There's a peg that's going to go in there, and then you're going to hold that in place as you rotate the whole thing over and slot the whole thing down in place. The trigger linkage is going to go, there's another hole that it needs to go to right here, right above the trigger, and then everything should seat down properly if all is well, and it appears to be. We are then going to use one of our washer-headed screws to hold that trigger link in place. And we're going to use our last washer-headed screw on this screw port right here to hold the internals in. The first, there's going to be a couple of other screws, but we're going to put that one in so it doesn't wander. We're then going to put this piece in place. And it goes right behind that trigger linkage on a screw post here in the back. Next, we're going to put in this, our trigger, and there's nothing holding it in place, which is kind of surprising, honestly, but I didn't design it. Next, we've got a few more screws to put in to hold the shell together. We've got one right here. There's a slot, a notch that allows you to get a screw in right there. We then have two more screws up here on the top, holding the internals to that green top cover rail thing. Next, we need to deal with that slide return spring, which is down in here, and I recommend using a small Phillips screwdriver. You probably could have hooked it on before you put the internals in, and it might be easier, but if you didn't, here's how you can do it. Get your screwdriver in, put the screwdriver through, and then there's a post right here, a screw post. You are going to hook the screwdriver on that and pull it forward to hook that spring on there. We then have this part that sits down on top of that, keeps that spring from going, and then acts as a screw mount for our muzzle. We then, of course, have this. We have our top rail nubbin, which actually has a nice seating for its spring, unlike most blasters, so that's nice. And then we have this mystery little piece. Strange little brick. It goes right up here on the front of the green rail. There is a groove in it. That should be going down because there is a notch that lines up with it. And that, again, acts as a screw mount for the muzzle. That's a part that may have wandered on you. Okay, now we want to check our wiring, make sure we're not going to pinch anything when we put this in. And you will want to make sure that all of your cables are in their appropriate grooves. They did a fairly good job at cable management. I don't know why they chose to put the battery housing on this side when they could have just as easily put it on the other side and not had to deal with wires coming from one side of the blaster to the other. But again, didn't nobody ask me. Make sure you're not pinching any wires, because if you pinch a wire and then screw it down, you can in fact sever the wire. I do not want you sticking up. Okay. Everything should go together smoothly. And then we're gonna put in a couple of screws. So we're gonna go with the longer ones, which go in the thicker sections of the blaster. And we're just gonna put in enough so that I can actually test this, because I don't want to completely reassemble it, only to discover that I got something wrong. Sorry about that, the battery on my camera gave out. Anyway, we're back to the final reassembly. All of the wider parts of the blaster use the longest screws. Then we have one down here at the bottom of the handle is going to use our really short screw. There's only one of them. Okay, we'll have some of the smaller ones here in the rail, as per usual. And some smaller ones here in the grip. And then finally, our muzzle will go on the front here. Make sure we don't... Oh, wrong way. Sure our wire is safe, and then we have two medium screws that held it on. And that should be it. Let's give the controls a check. Lights are still working. We can still load rounds. Sure enough, they go in. We can prime. It chambers. Ejection works. Prime chamber. Oh, did we not chamber? What's the boggle? Now, we've got a lock somewhere not disengaging. That's not good. There we go. All right. Try it again. Yep. There we go. All right. Everything does appear to be working now. So this is a neat, like I said, somewhat unique blaster in many of its features. It is a little bit finicky, as are most of the Vortex blasters. Often due to people trying to force the trigger and breaking them when they show up at Goodwill. But this was a neat one. So hopefully this helped some of you, if you were foolish enough to fully disassemble us, or if yours jammed or broke or whatnot and you needed to figure out how to put it back together. Now you know how. Survey for what blasters you would like me to cover in the future will be down in the description. I will probably take a step away from Vortex for a while, because these are rough. I will probably go back to dart blasters for a while. I would still like to do either the Hades or the Artemis or both, but I still only have my modified ones. I will probably look into acquiring a stock one so that I can do those, because those have gotten a lot of votes, and for obvious reasons they are complicated, and I would like to show them. So that's what's going on. Hope this helps somebody. Thank you for watching.